The air in the grand hall of the Fort McNair Officers Club was thick with history and the low, respectful hum of conversation. Polished metals gleamed on chests, and the scent of old wood and starched dress uniforms filled my lungs as I stepped inside. My heels clicked softly on the marble floor, a quiet announcement of my arrival. Across the room, bathed in the warm glow of a chandelier, I saw them. My family. They were a perfect little portrait of military pride, gathered in a tight, impenetrable circle. At the center of it all was my father, Colonel David Langston, a man who saw the world through the narrow scope of his own infantry career. He was holding court, laughing, his hand resting proudly on the shoulder of my brother. Captain Kevin Langston, the golden child, stood there looking every bit the perfect soldier, the living continuation of the legacy our father cherished. And next to them was my mother, Carol, a woman who had long ago decided that smoothing over conflict was the same as solving it. She smiled up at her husband, her face a mask of wifely adoration. As I drew closer, my father's gaze met mine, and his smile didn't just falter, it evaporated. He leaned towards my mother, his voice a low murmur that sliced through the pleasant sound of the string quartet. "What is she doing here?" he murmured, the words hitting me with the force of a physical blow. I didn't think she'd actually come. I saw my mother's shoulders tense as she gave me a tight, pained smile that was more of a wince. Kevin just offered a curt, dismissive nod, his expression a perfect mirror of our father's profound disappointment. The warm bubble of celebration they had built around themselves turned instantly to ice. I was on the outside, a ghost at the feast, an unwelcome variable in their carefully constructed equation of family honor. The sting of it was sharp, but horribly familiar. It was the same feeling I got when they celebrated Kevin's promotions but forgot to call for mine. The same cold shoulder I received when I chose a different path they didn't understand. This was just another entry in the long, silent ledger of my invisibility. He made it clear I wasn't part of the legacy he was celebrating tonight. And the worst part, as my own father looked at me like I was a clerical error, I wasn't even surprised. It was just the loudest echo of a story I had been living my whole life. My father, Colonel David Langston, believed in a very specific version of honor. It was forged in mud and grit, measured in miles marched and bullets fired. To him, the army was the infantry, and everything else was just a supporting cast. His entire identity was wrapped up in this narrow, rigid definition, and he expected his family to reflect that glory back at him. My brother, Kevin, was a perfect mirror. He never questioned, never deviated. He chose the same branch, the same career path, the same life, and for that, he was rewarded with the full, blinding light of our father's pride. He was the Langston legacy. I was something else, an addendum, a footnote they'd rather ignore. I remember the night I told them I'd been accepted into the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Corps. We were at the dinner table, the same oak table where every major family announcement was made. Kevin had just been praised for acing a land navigation course, and my father was beaming. I thought, naively, that my own good news would be met with the same warmth. When I told them, the silence was heavy and immediate. My father put his fork down slowly, his brow furrowed not with interest, but with a kind of weary confusion. "Military intelligence?" he finally asked, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "So, you'll be a glorified librarian? Pushing paper while your brother is out there leading men?" That was the moment the narrative was cemented. My mother, ever the peacekeeper, jumped in with her usual placating tone. "Now David, it's still the army. Your father just worries, Sophia, that's all. Kevin's path is more straightforward, more honorable. The word hung in the air between us. My path was dishonorable. It was a deviation from the script, and in our family, deviations were not celebrated. They were tolerated at best and condemned at worst. I learned that night that my service would never be seen as equal, because it was quiet, cerebral, and happened in rooms without flags and marching bands. It happened in the shadows, so to them, it might as well not have happened at all. The internal ledger I kept grew longer with each passing year. When Kevin graduated from airborne school, our backyard was transformed into a massive party. Catered food, dozens of guests, and my father giving a teary-eyed toast about his son, the paratrooper, the warrior. I remember standing in the corner of that party, feeling like a ghost. My own recent commendation for analytical excellence tucked away in a drawer, unmentioned. Years later, when I was promoted to major, a huge step, a gateway to senior command, the celebration consisted of a brief, awkward phone call. My father spent most of it talking about Kevin's upcoming field training exercise, before handing the phone to my mother, who said, "Well, that's nice, dear," and then asked if I was eating properly. They had no frame of reference for my success, because they'd never bothered to learn the language of my world. When I took leave to get my master's degree in strategic security studies, I paid for it myself because money was tight, only to see them buy Kevin a new truck as a welcome home gift from a short rotation. While I was on deployments they never asked about, deployments where my intelligence briefs directly impacted the safety of soldiers like my brother, they were telling their friends, "Oh, Sophia? She does something with computers for the army." They reduced my life's work, the immense weight of my responsibilities, to a simple, dismissible desk job. They didn't know my rank, my specialty, or the life and death stakes I dealt with before breakfast. They didn't know because they never asked. They didn't want to know. My career was a quiet, complex thing, and it was so much easier for them to simply bask in the loud, simple glory of their golden child. My success didn't fit the family story, so they just pretended it didn't exist. Kevin was the hero. I was the hobbyist. Standing there in that banquet hall, listening to them praise Kevin's latest rotation, I realized they would never see me. Not the real me. So I decided, quietly and finally, to stop waiting for them to open their eyes. It was time to make them see the truth instead. For years I had chased a ghost, the ghost of my father's approval. Every achievement, every promotion, was a silent plea to be seen, to be valued in the same way my brother was. But standing in that banquet hall, the chill of their disappointment washing over me, something finally broke. It wasn't a loud, shattering thing. It was a quiet, internal shift. The endless quest for their validation simply ended. The goal was no longer to win their love. The goal was justice. Not a loud, angry revenge, but a quiet, undeniable correction of the record. The receipt I needed wasn't a piece of paper. It was my entire career, my very existence, which they had so thoroughly chosen to ignore. The formal invitation to the retirement ceremony had arrived a month earlier, a thick, cream-colored cardstock with embossed Army insignia. My first instinct was to throw it in the trash. Why endure another performance of my own irrelevance? Why sit through hours of toasts to a legacy I was deliberately excluded from? It felt like accepting an invitation to watch someone read your obituary while you were still in the room. For days I left it on my counter, a constant reminder of the decision I had to make: continue to be their ghost, or finally walk away from the haunting altogether. The turning point came in an unlikely place, the stark, quiet office of my mentor. Major General Thorne was a 3-decade veteran of the intelligence community, a man whose quiet demeanor concealed one of the sharpest strategic minds in the Pentagon. He'd guided my career for years, and he understood the nuances of my family dynamic better than anyone. I sat opposite his vast mahogany desk and confessed my hesitation about the ceremony. I explained that it felt pointless, a submission to their narrative. He listened patiently, his hands steepled, his gaze never leaving my face. He didn't offer sympathy or platitudes. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then, he leaned forward slightly. "Your father's service is one kind of story, Sophia," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Your service is another. Both are part of the Army's history. I believe it's important for the complete story to be present in that room." He let that sink in before he continued. "As the presiding officer, military protocol requires me to formally acknowledge any attending general officers. It's not a choice, it's a professional courtesy, a matter of regulation." He said it so plainly, without a hint of conspiracy or a knowing wink. It wasn't a plot, it was procedure. A new kind of clarity washed over me. The plan wasn't mine to make. It had already been written into the very rules and traditions my father worshipped. I didn't need to gather evidence or prepare a speech. I didn't need to fight for the microphone. The system itself, the institution to which we had both dedicated our lives, would speak for me. My only task was to show up. My presence, in uniform, would be the catalyst. The anger and hurt I had carried for years dissolved into a cold, calm resolve. This wasn't about embarrassing my father. This was about honoring my own truth in a forum he could not ignore or dismiss. I had the uniform, pressed and perfect. I had the official invitation, and I had the institutional protocol of the United States Army on my side. All that was left was to choose my seat and wait for the official record to be corrected. I chose a small table near the back of the hall, an island of solitude in a sea of dress uniforms. From there, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the head table. My family was seated in the place of honor, right next to the top brass. My father looked more alive than I had seen him in years, his chest puffed out with pride. My mother was radiant, touching his arm and laughing, while my brother Kevin sat straight-backed and serious, the dutiful son. They were the picture of a perfect military dynasty, completely unaware of the ghost watching them from the cheap seats. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. I wasn't there to plead for a seat at their table anymore. I was just there to watch the show. After the dinner plates were cleared, my father rose to a wave of warm applause. He walked to the podium and began his retirement speech. He thanked his mentors, the soldiers he had commanded, and, of course, his loving, supportive wife. Then he turned to my brother. For 5 full minutes, he spoke about Kevin. He recounted tales of his son's grit at West Point, his leadership in the field, his unwavering commitment to the infantry. "It is the greatest honor of my life," my father said, his voice thick with emotion, "to know that my son, Captain Kevin Langston, carries the torch of the Langston infantry legacy forward." He scanned the adoring crowd. He never once mentioned my name. In the story of his life, I was a chapter that had been ripped out. And as he spoke, I felt nothing. The space where the hurt used to be was just quiet. I was no longer a participant in their drama. I was an observer, waiting for the final act. When he finished, the room gave him a standing ovation. He returned to his seat, basking in the glow. Then, Major General Thorne took the stage. He began with eloquent, standard praise for my father's 30 years of service, highlighting key moments of his career. The room was settled, comfortable, nodding along to the familiar beats of a retirement ceremony. The applause was warm and respectful. Everything was proceeding exactly as my father had always dreamed it would. The general let the applause die down, and then he paused. He took a sip of water, his gaze sweeping across the entire hall, from the head table all the way to me in the back. The atmosphere shifted. "Colonel Langston spoke of legacy," the general began, his voice taking on a new weight, a new authority. "And while his infantry service is commendable, it's crucial for everyone here to understand the full scope of the Langston family's contribution to this nation's defense." A confused murmur rippled through the front tables. My father and brother exchanged a puzzled look. The general gave a polite nod toward my brother. "Many of you know his son, Captain Langston, and we're proud of him." More polite applause, but it was hesitant now. The room was holding its breath. "But what many of you don't know," the general continued, his voice resonating with power, "is that one of the most critical strategic minds in this command, in the entire United States Army, also bears the Langston name." He turned, his eyes scanning the room deliberately, and then they locked with mine. The spotlight operator, following his gaze, swung a brilliant, white circle of light directly onto my table. Everything went silent. "In military intelligence," General Thorne boomed, "the greatest successes are the ones you never hear about. The wars that never happen. The soldiers who come home because of information they never knew they had." He held the room captive. "We have an officer here tonight who is the strategic mind behind Operation Griffin, one of the most successful counterterrorism campaigns in recent history. A campaign that has saved countless American lives." The silence was now absolute. I could see my father's face, a mask of utter disbelief. My mother's hand was frozen halfway to her mouth. Kevin looked like he had been struck by lightning. The general's voice cut through the silence like a saber. Would Brigadier General Sophia Langston please stand and be recognized? I stood up slowly, my back straight, my gaze fixed on the general. The title, my title, hung in the air, a fact as solid and undeniable as the floor beneath my feet. A wave of shock rolled through the room, followed by a sudden, thunderous roar of applause. It wasn't polite. It was genuine, explosive respect from a room full of people who understood exactly what that rank and that operation meant. They were clapping for me. For my work. For the truth. And in the ringing silence that followed the applause, as my father stared at me not as his daughter, but as a superior officer, I didn't feel anger or victory. I just felt free. For the first time, I was the one who got to walk away. I remained standing for a moment as the applause washed over me, a wave of validation so powerful it felt like it could wipe away years of being invisible. Dozens of officers, colonels, majors, even a few fellow generals I knew only by reputation, began moving toward my table, their hands extended, their faces alight with genuine respect and curiosity. They wanted to talk about Operation Griffin, about my time in the Intelligence Directorate, about the real work. For the first time in a family setting, I was not an anomaly. I was an asset. It was a dizzying, clarifying feeling. But before I could shake the first hand, a figure pushed through the crowd with a frantic urgency. It was my mother, her face pale and her eyes wide with a kind of panicked fury. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Sophia, what have you done?" she hissed, her voice low and trembling. "You embarrassed your father. On his night. You made his retirement all about you." Her words were meant to be daggers, the same old weapons of guilt she had wielded my whole life. She was trying to pull me back into their story, to make me the villain who had ruined the perfect family portrait. I looked at her, at the frantic fear in her eyes, the fear of a carefully constructed reality crumbling to dust. The old me would have argued, would have defended myself, would have felt that familiar surge of hopeless anger. But the new me simply felt a quiet pity. I said nothing. I just gently removed her hand from my arm, gave her a look that I'm sure held no anger or malice, and turned away to shake the outstretched hand of a waiting colonel. I didn't have to fight her anymore. I could just leave her behind. The next morning there were voicemails from my brother, each one more accusatory than the last. He called me selfish, arrogant, and disrespectful. He didn't see a sister who had finally been recognized. He saw a rival who had stolen his spotlight and, worse, had upstaged our father. It was all about their feelings, their honor, their narrative. I listened to the first 30 seconds of one message before deleting them all. They were just echoes from a room I had already left. The real test, however, came later that week. An email appeared in my inbox. The sender was my father. For a full minute, I just stared at the subject line, which was simply your name. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I just felt a weary curiosity. I clicked it open. The message was only 2 lines. "Did not know the extent of your work. Congratulations on your success." That was it. No apology. No remorse. No, "I'm sorry for the years I made you feel worthless." It was a statement of fact. A sterile acknowledgement from a man more concerned with updating his own information than with mending a lifetime of neglect. It was the email of a stranger correcting a file, and in that moment I saw with perfect clarity that he would never change. The emotional core I had hoped to find in him simply wasn't there. I moved my cursor over the email, hovered it over the trash can icon, and with a quiet click, I erased it forever. A weight I didn't even know I was still carrying lifted from my shoulders. The ledger was finally completely closed. A few weeks later, I was standing in a place that felt more like home than my childhood house ever had, a secure compartmented information facility, or SCIF, deep in the bowels of the Pentagon. There were no grand chandeliers here, only the stark functional glow of fluorescent lights on whiteboards covered in complex diagrams. My team was assembled around a briefing table. They were colonels, senior analysts, and civilian specialists, some of the brightest minds in the nation, and they were all looking at me. Here, I wasn't Brigadier General Langston, the anomaly. I was Sophia. the lead strategist for our next operation. Here, respect wasn't demanded by a surname, it was earned through competence and collaboration. This was my community, this was my family, the one I had built for myself. I heard through the grapevine that my father had retreated into a sullen silence, telling his old infantry buddies that my career was too political, and that what I did wasn't the real army. My brother, I was told, remained bitter, seeing my success not as a family achievement but as a personal slight. Their story hadn't changed. They were still clinging to the narrative that made them comfortable, the one where they were the heroes and I was the footnote. But the most wonderful, most liberating part was that it no longer mattered. Their opinions were just noise from a distant frequency I no longer tuned into. Their power over me was gone, because I had taken it back. I was defined not by the name they gave me, but by the rank and the responsibilities I had earned. I learned that you can't force people to see your worth, you can only decide that their validation is no longer a requirement for it to exist. If you've ever had to build your own legacy when the world tried to write you out of the story, share it in the comments below. Your service is recognized here.